In the early morning hours of January 26, 1988, 911 receives an emergency call. A fire has broken out in a large apartment building. The Colorado Springs Fire Department races to the scene. The smoke is concentrated in one unit. When they get the blaze under control, the firefighters find several items of clothing smoldering on the floor. They appear to have been deliberately set on fire. Firefighters search the apartment. At first, it's all clear. Then they go into the bedroom. A man is laying unconscious on the floor.
It appeared that he had succumbed to smoke inhalation, but firefighters, upon closer inspection, observed stab wounds in his chest.
Firefighters check for a pulse but find nothing. They immediately call the police.
He was found dead in his apartment due to multiple stab wounds and incise wounds. Some of those wounds entered the abdomen and some of which entered the back. It was clear that some of these injuries occurred after he was dead. When you have cases like that, you know there's been a lot of extreme violence and a lot of anger delivered towards the person to the point at which they continue to injure that person after that person is clearly non-responsive and dead.
Papers and documents in the apartment indicate the victim is Victor Woods, a 31-year-old bike shop employee. The question is whether the fire and the homicide are related.
Concealment fires are very uncommon. It's not something that happens very frequently at all. Generally, if you have a concealment fire, it's because there is something that the suspect believes that is personal to them or is an identifying factor to them that they're trying to destroy, so that it stops that trail of leads for investigators to follow up to try and identify that suspect.
There's a lot of different things you can interpret out of that. One is that this was maybe a act where it was a spur-of-the-moment type thing. I killed the person, now the person goes into panic mode and figures I've got to hide the body, I've got to hide the death. Fire is an easy result.
If the fire was started to destroy the body, police know this is no ordinary crime scene. Veteran detective Lt.Joe Kenda takes over the investigation.
I walk into this apartment. There is a white male in his 30s, Victor Woods. He's been multiply stabbed. One of the wounds is an eviscerating wound. It's a violent, savage attack. My first thought when I looked at him, I said, wow, who made this happen to you? What did you do? What did you say that made somebody do this?
Looking around the apartment, Lieutenant Kenda is stunned to see that the smoke alarm has been disabled.
When I saw that smoke alarm gone, you get a feeling come over you like, oh my, oh my. He just didn't want to kill this guy. He didn't care who he killed. There were 220 or so people residing in that building. A lot of children, a lot of babies, a lot of adults. A building like that would burn to the ground in a matter of a few minutes. It tells me that this person doesn't care how many people they kill. In my mind, I thought he was exceptionally dangerous. He was willing to take that step, and I felt compelled to really get on this. We have to find this guy.
Kenda examines the victim. Woods has been stabbed numerous times in the chest.
There is blood, and there is blood spatter. It's not uncommon in multiple stab. You get what's called cast-off bleeding. The first blow produces blood. The second blow disperses it. You've got a large bladed knife swung with great force into the victim, and every time that blade's withdrawn and raised back for another strike, it throws blood off the blade onto the ceiling, onto the walls, onto the surrounding area. I've even seen multiple stab wounds where you can count the number of wounds by the number of streaks on the ceiling. You count the streaks and you add one, and that's pretty close to your number of wounds. I'm thinking he's been stabbed between 8 and 10 times.
And judging from the blood spatter, police are looking for a large blade. They don't have to search very far. A kitchen knife with an 8-inch blade sits on a TV tray next to a chair.
It is soaked in blood, both the hilt and the blade. Most likely our murder weapon Where did that come from? Look around in the kitchen, there's a knife block. The big blade is missing. That's our source. It tells me one important thing. Weapon of opportunity. Whatever went wrong in here wasn't planned. So they didn't come here with a weapon. They obtained one while they were here and left it behind.
A knife being used in a homicide has a lot of other potential other than just harming the victim, especially if it's a case where they've stabbed multiple times and now the knife is bloody, their hand is bloody, and it's slick. A hand can slip and actually end up receiving some injury as a result of running over the knife blade itself.
And a wound on the killer may be just as important as a wound on the victim.
I look in the sink and I see athletic socks. They're white. They are the same that are in the dressers in the victim's bedroom. They probably come from the apartment. They're blood-soaked. Those socks in the sink tell me our man's hurt. That blood belongs to the bad guy, not to our victim. He's cleaning up in that sink, or he's trying to.
The socks are sent to the lab for analysis. Police search the apartment for more evidence. They don't find any latent prints, but they also don't find any signs of forced entry. And that may be another clue.
The victim is familiar with the person that they allowed in. They're comfortable with them. They allowed them into their space so that it was easy access for the predator to enter in to commit that crime.
The crime scene provides Kenda with an initial profile of the suspect.
It's pretty apparent there's been overkill, and two things pop to mind. One is a crime of passion, and the other is rage. Either someone was very angry with this person, or somebody had a passionate relationship with that person. Something goes very wrong, and the relationship explodes in violence.
Police turn their attention from inside the apartment to outside. Maybe someone saw the killer leave the scene. Lieutenant Kenda talks with the caller who reported the fire, a 25-year-old pharmacist living in the unit above Victor Woods. She says that sometime around 2:15 a.m., she heard a loud scream.
She thinks it's a woman's scream, and she thinks the woman says, "Don't do that." She hears sounds of a struggle, like maybe a fight, but she doesn't hear anything else. She looks out the window to see if there's anything in the window, and she notices a car. She thought it was a Trans Am. She wasn't sure. Thought it was black, maybe had blue pinstripes on it. She'd never seen the car there before. She thought that was odd.
A second witness comes forward. She's a young athlete training at the nearby U.S. Olympic facility.
She got hurt during her training. She had a back injury, had difficulty with it, had trouble sleeping. She got up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to get a can of pop out of the vending machine. She sees a car leave, really high rate of speed. Car takes off out of the lot. Very loud mufflers, loud engine, but she doesn't see who's in it. She's not sure what color it is, and it leaves at the moment she sees the smoke.
At this point in the investigation, detectives' only lead is a car leaving the scene at approximately the same time as the murder. Lieutenant Kenda circles back to the victim.
The next step is the most important one. Where was Victor? Where did he encounter this person who decided to kill him? So our focus at that point is, give me a timeline on Victor. When was he last seen alive? And we now know when he's dead. Where was he in between? Because that's the key to finding whoever's with him in this apartment.
Investigators contact Victor's employer and co-workers at the bike shop. Some of them tell detectives that Victor had been having some run-ins with another employee.
Oh, really? I like run-ins. What kind of run-in? Name-calling and yelling and screaming back and forth. seemed kind of odd to me that you would have that kind of heated argument among coworkers. So now we have someone else who's interesting. The car is interesting. This guy's promising. He doesn't like that guy, and he really doesn't like him. Well, we need a guy that really doesn't like him, because that's who killed him.
In January 1988, police find 31-year-old Victor Woods stabbed to death in his own apartment. The killer intended to destroy any clues by setting a fire, but it never caught.
He wants to prevent the discovery. He wants the police to believe this guy died in a fire. He didn't get it done.
Investigators run a background check on Victor and learn that he moved out to Colorado from Ohio.
Vic loved the outdoors. I mean, whether it was heading up to the mountains skiing during the winter or being on his bike, just even around town.
He would walk off the beaten path. A very unique individual. I guess I never knew anyone like him. He was, I think, made for Colorado.
After settling in, Victor Woods took a job working in a specialty bike shop.
It had been a couple years, and he had worked at a bicycle shop as a mechanic, and he had gotten recruited by someone down in Colorado Springs. They're opening a new shop, and that he thought there might be potential for advancement in the new company.
He's very good at building and working on and selling bicycles. He's the right guy in the right place at the right time. The guy hires him. So Victor's doing fine. He's getting along.
The news of Victor's murder stuns his family and friends.
I was basically devastated. I just could not believe it.
The only information I had was none. I did not know who he might have been hanging with or what was going on there. Vic, had no enemies. He just wasn't that kind of guy.
We did talk to the local ex-girlfriend. Nothing unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. They just decided to break up, but normal relationship, normal guy. No issues with him as far as she knew. Victor's family provides a picture of a pleasant man who is in the bicycle business. There is no history in Victor's background that would suggest he has ever been involved in any of the high-risk behaviors that often wind up in people getting killed.
When investigators talk to Victor's co-workers, however, they discover that he may have made an enemy.
Well, Victor and this guy, they don't get along. What does that mean? Explain that more to me. They say that Victor and this particular guy have often argued, heated arguments over the method by which a bike was to be repaired, and it was always a bickering contest that got several times out of control. And you think, well, is that a reason to kill for? Well, some people don't need a reason, but that's not a reason. I thought there had to be something else to that. Why so heated? Why so escalating? Why so angry? If all it is about work, there's got to be something else there.
The question is, what is that something? Police bring the coworker in for questioning.
He denies everything, of course. He's angry, he feels trapped, he's frightened, he's all the right things. Nothing about him is unusual. Takes a while, but he finally says, well, it's more than about the repairs. Okay, because now I want you to tell me a story I'll believe. Don't tell me about fighting with this guy because you don't like his technique, because that's bull. Tell me what you feel. Why are you so pissed at this guy? And he finally tells me the truth, or something at least I believe. This guy was the top dog in his shop until Victor showed up. Now the guy's afraid he's going to lose his job, because Victor is really good at what he does. And he's obviously much better than this guy. So he reacts out of self-defense to yell at Victor and try to minimize his skills and so on. And he's just trying to protect himself. Okay, I can believe that story. This makes sense to me. But still, we're going to play the game. We use the polygraph tool. You take a polygraph about this, about killing Victor? Of course.
During the polygraph, the suspect denies being involved in the death of Victor Woods. But the test results tell a different story.
He takes the polygraph. He doesn't do well in the polygraph. That doesn't matter to me. The outcome of a polygraph doesn't make a difference to me unless there's an admission. My only purpose in using it is to get you to tell me, not the machine. You tell me.
Kenda wants a confession, but instead gets an alibi for the night of the murder.
It turns out he belongs to a pool league. They stay there all night, shoot pool in the league. Nobody leaves. They go to breakfast at an all-night restaurant afterwards. They're not leave the restaurant until 4 o'clock in the morning. He's with them. He's not anything to do with this killing. So now we're back to square one.
Square one is the dead body of Victor Woods in a fast car leaving his apartment complex at 2 a.m. Investigators set their sights on Victor's last known whereabouts.
He likes to go to the Yukon Tavern. He likes to go there because it's kind of a hot place for people in their 30s, which this guy is, and it's close to where he lives. It's about 1.5 miles up the street from where he resides. They thought he went there that night, the night before he's discovered. He worked that day, and he got off in the afternoon, and he told his friends he was going to go to the Yukon Tavern for happy hour. So this is good. We know where he worked. We know he worked that day. We know, or we think we know, he went to the Yukon Tavern. At least that's what he told his friends. We find out Victor Woods is there routinely, and he was there that night. That he is a regular. They know him. Everybody in there knows him. They describe him as a nice guy. They also say he can get a little obnoxious when he gets drunk. He stays there all night, and he gets loaded. But he doesn't go home, and he won't leave. Keeps trying to drink. They finally cut him off. He gets mad about that. He wants more to drink. Finally, the place is starting to drift out because it's closing time.
A bartender and one of the waitresses both remember a guy sitting at the bar with Victor. A white male in his 30s.
The cocktail waitress says he's really good looking, looks like a movie star. She was struck by him. She was attracted to him. Handsome, handsome guy. Looks to be in excellent shape, has a tan.
The witnesses recall seeing the two men leaving the bar together at about 1:30 a.m.
The bartender says that after they left, she heard a car start. She described it as a muscle car, and she said that car had some throat. Oh, now we're back from the car at the apartments to maybe something promising.
It's frustrating to get information that you know is linking two different crimes and would be leading you towards a suspect. However, it seems that there's really nowhere to go with it. How do you identify a vehicle that people have said they heard, but you can't really go anywhere with it until you've got that extra factor that's going to point to a specific person, specific car, specific location.
Without a license plate or an identifiable driver, the car is just a tease. Who was behind the wheel the night Victor was killed?
This maniac is on the loose. He's already killed once. And my gut is telling me he likes it, and he's going to kill again.
Several days after the murder of Victor Woods, the police have very few leads in their investigation.
It was a mystery. It was like, why would somebody do that to somebody and then set a fire? You're obviously putting a lot of other people in danger as well, people who lived in that apartment complex. So it kind of takes on a whole different meaning than just a basic fire.
The Colorado Bureau of Investigation examines the bloody socks found in the kitchen. As Kenda suspected, tests show that the blood was not the victim's, but instead probably belonged to the suspect. But the test results don't point to anyone specific.
Detectives have very little to go on. They have a vague description of a car, a vague description of a guy that matches half the men in the United States, 35 and under.
I got zip. So we're gonna try off-the-wall stuff, then maybe get lucky. We got one witness that says this is a jacked-up, customized car. Is she right? I don't know. In the absence of anything else, let's go with that. So I have my guys start contacting custom car clubs, auto body shops, muffler shops, places that commonly do work on cars like that and who commonly know gearheads who have cars like that.
You want to make sure everybody knows that this vehicle, this suspect, this description fits a possible crime scene. You want to get that information out to as many people as possible in hopes that we come up with a lead.
Investigators canvass car shops across Colorado Springs, but to no avail.
We get nowhere. Nobody can put that kind of a car with that kind of a guy. So that straw that we're trying to grab, we can't reach it. We are doing a lot of work with no result. So we need to expand our horizons. What if he belongs to a car club somewhere else? So we expand our search.
Working the theory that their suspect may have connections outside of Colorado Springs, investigators send what they know about the case to the FBI.
There's a system put in place by the FBI called the VICAP system. It stands for Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, a method by which every police department in the country can enter information about unsolved cases. So if you have a case that's unsolved, it may compare to one in some other state or some other city. We entered the Victor Woods case into that system, and we got nowhere with that either. At this point in this investigation, we've done everything we can humanly think of to do, and we have learned exactly nothing. We haven't found our guy. We don't have a clue on who he is or where he is. And we've got this mountain of paper that is absolutely, at this point, meaningless.
When you have nothing to go on, those to me are the saddest, number one, because you've got nothing that you can work on. And they're the most frustrating because you just absolutely have nowhere you can go. You have thought of just about everything you can think of. You've run it by each other. You've talked to other detectives. You've discussed where we need to go, and you just aren't going anywhere.
Victor's friends begin to wonder if he had simply bumped into the wrong guy at the wrong place at the wrong tavern.
I would think if Victor was drinking and if he was unable to make it home, maybe he wouldn't have used the caution that he should have.
The connection to the bar reminds Kenda of something one of the waitresses told him at the beginning of the investigation.
When we're in the bar and we're talking to all these bar folks, we're talking to the waitress. The waitress is cute, young, dressed appropriately for a waitress. She remembers approaching this guy, our Mr. X, our movie star, and he didn't react to her at all. Didn't even speak to her, just looked at her. Her feeling? Well, he has to be homosexual. Why? Because he didn't respond to you?
The suggestion, however, forces investigators down another blind alley.
We talked to everybody Victor's ever known in his life, his family, his coworkers. We find no evidence, none, of any kind, of Victor Woods being homosexual in any way.
Once again, a strong lead goes nowhere.
I had a sign in my office. It says, "Mysteries make my head hurt." And they do. In this particular case, now I have the ultimate challenge. There's no link. There is no link to this guy. Who the hell is he? And how did he come into Victor Woods' life? It's like you sit there and just stare at the wall like, what did I forget? There's still no key here. Where is the key? And you look at your blank wall and you look at it and you say, who are you? Where are you? Where is your car that everybody says you have? What'd you do with the car? Who are you, man? Who are you?
The answer to these questions lies 40 miles south of Colorado Springs. On February 3rd, 1988, 8 days after the murder of Victor Woods, a souped-up Camaro pulls into the parking lot of a small hotel in Pueblo, Colorado. A man armed with a .38 caliber pistol gets out of the car and walks into the lobby.
He pointed a weapon at the clerk and he told the clerk that this is a robbery. About that time, a security guard who was making his rounds around the outside of the hotel entered the lobby. And then the man with the weapon pointed it at the security guard. And he said, "I know you are armed. Don't go for your weapon." And then he approached the security guard, disarmed the security guard, and then shot the security guard right in the face. The security guard fell to the floor, but he did survive, and he was able to hear what happened next. He told us that he heard the suspect go back toward the lobby. He heard a second gunshot, which would have been the shot that killed the clerk laying on the floor. And then he heard the suspect leave the hotel, and he heard a loud vehicle, like a loud muscle car, pull out of the parking lot of the hotel.
The cold-blooded killing shocks the small community.
It was the kind of thing where, wow, this poor person was just at work doing his job, and somebody comes in for really no reason other than, maybe a small robbery that's not going to net a lot of money, and shoots this young man just in cold blood.
Lieutenant Kenda doesn't know it yet, but Victor Woods was just the beginning. Kenda is now hunting a serial killer, and the clock is ticking. When Victor Woods is found murdered, the only clues to the killer's identity are that he's a white male in his early 30s and that he drives a loud muscle car. So when investigators fail to turn up any new leads, the trail goes cold. But a week later, a second man turns up dead. This time, however, police have a solid lead. According to the hotel workers, this same suspect robbed the same hotel several weeks earlier.
There was a robbery in January of 1988 in which a female clerk was held up. She had a pretty good description of the person who robbed her.
The clerk provides a description eerily similar to the bartenders at the Yukon Tavern. A good-looking white male in his early 30s. This time, news reports of the shooting result in a tip to the police hotline.
The caller who called in the tip to Crime Stoppers stated that they had overheard Ronald Lee White making comments about having hit the hotel the first time and was going to do it again. The caller then assumed that the second robbery that resulted in the murder was the work of Ronald White.
A background check reveals that Ronald Lee White has a long and extensive criminal record. It also shows that he's been living in an apartment in Colorado Springs. Pueblo investigators immediately contact the Colorado Springs PD SWAT team. However, notification of the impending arrest doesn't reach Lieutenant Kenda.
We pulled a photograph of Ronald Lee White, and we used that in the photo arrays that we showed to the victims. Once we had him identified as the killer, we worked with the Colorado Springs Police Department. Their tactical enforcement unit set up on Ronald White's residence.
White has no idea the cops are outside. As he leaves his apartment, police make the arrest. White is brought to the station. He is one of the most chilling suspects local police officers have ever seen.
When you look at a picture of Ronald Lee White, you see a blank stare in his eyes. I've seen that stare before in people who have committed very vicious crimes. When you look in a face like that, you know that you're looking at a very dangerous, very heartless, uncaring individual.
He's the type of person that is really there's no more rehabilitation involved with Ronald White. There's only taking him off the streets and making sure he can't hurt other people.
On the day after White's arrest in Pueblo, A startling report arrives at the Colorado Springs Police Department.
I run across this Rimmen bulletin, Rocky Mountain Information Network, describing the arrest of one Ronald Lee White, described as a white male, brown hair, hazel eyes. He's born in 1955, makes him in his early 30s. He has a Chevy Camaro blue with light blue pinstripes. He's under arrest for 2 counts of murder. This absolutely piques my interest. Instantly, look what we have here. Maybe we have our guy. But I'm trying to hold back my excitement because I've been disappointed in this case 5,000 times. But this guy fits very nicely, and he is the right look, and he is the right car, and he's violent. So I like it, but I'm just a little bit afraid of liking it too much. But we gotta look into this.
While investigators believe White is the right suspect in the hotel shooting, can they connect him to Victor Woods?
We take his picture out to the waitress at the bar. We get a looks like ID. Not a positive ID. That looks like the guy. Great. Bartender the same. Looks like the guy. There's no positive ID. We can't put him anyplace. Do I have anything I can take to court? No, I don't. The car is the closest link we have, but we have a witness that thinks it's a Trans Am. His car is a Camaro. The only thing I have is reasonable suspicion. He might be our killer. That's not enough to make the charges stick, but it is enough to warrant a conversation. I need to talk to this guy. I need to get Ronald Lee White to tell me he killed Victor Woods. I need that confession.
White is the type of case that you want to do everything you can, from the district attorney's office to the police department, through the multiple jurisdictions, to make sure that we arrest as soon as possible so that he doesn't kill again and that we convict.
The evidence points towards Ronald Lee White as the primary suspect in the Victor Woods case. But is it enough? Without any guarantees, the veteran detective decides to face off with a possible serial killer in an effort to make him confess.
In many ways, it's a game of poker for all the money. Except we're playing with his life.
On February 8th, 1988, 13 days after the murder of Victor Woods, a new suspect emerges, Ronald Lee White. He's already under arrest for murder in Pueblo, Colorado. But did he kill Victor as well?
I have reasonable suspicion. Do I have anything else? Nope. I don't even have enough to arrest him. But I might be able to play him. I might be able to get him to tell me. So our plan is formulated. We're going to request the Pueblo PD to bring him to the Springs. Now, I want him a little off balance. I want him to wonder why he's being driven somewhere else. Make him think about it. The drive up from Pueblo takes 45 minutes to an hour. Ample time for Ronald Lee White to wonder what is happening. If he is who I think he is, his personality is such that if he thinks you already know, he will tell you what he's done. If he doesn't think you know, he won't tell you anything.
Kenda has his detectives talk to him first, but White just sits there, apparently unfazed by the situation.
He just finds this all to be annoying. You got anybody else in the interrogation room that's under arrest for murder already, and you're about to tag him for another one, he's shaking so bad he can't sit still. That's what makes him a scary dude. He is not the boy next door. He might look like the boy next door, but he isn't. When I walk in, White is asleep. Even though he's in a major jam, he's bored. That's what kind of person White is. But I walk in, I'm a new face. There's a no smoking sign on the wall of the interrogation room, and I see his eyes go to it. Would you like a cigarette, Ron? Well, there's this sign. Yeah, I know, but I kind of run this place, so I can kind of do what I want to. So I gave him a cigarette. He's cuffed in front of him. I gave him a lighter because I wanted to get a better look at his hand without him thinking I'm looking at it. It's been treated now, but still it's going to be consistent with a hand slipping off a handle onto a blade. So he lights his cigarette. We talk for a minute. I said, you know why you're here, Ron? I don't know, is the response. Oh, let me explain. People see things, Ron. People see you. Sometimes you don't see them or you don't pay attention. Like the waitress in the bar who identifies you positively that you're the guy that's in the bar. And of course there's that bartender who positively identified you as talking to Victor. 2 other women at the apartment complex. They see your car. They see smoke. That's the night you killed Victor Woods. You see what I mean? People notice things.
Kenda now has Ronald Lee White's full attention.
He's just looking at me, not responding. Not saying anything, just looking at me. You killed him, didn't you? He came on to me, man. He came on to me. I said, Ronnie, try again. He looked at me and smiled and said, well, maybe he just pissed me off. I killed him, like you said. I cut my hand in that knife. That hurt too.
White confesses to killing Woods, but never explains what really happened that fateful night. Kenda believes that the evening started off as nothing more than 2 guys talking to each other in a bar.
The thing that's so spooky about that whole affair, it's a chance encounter. I don't think there was anything more to it than that. I think that the likelihood is that Victor is drunk. Victor wants a ride home because he's afraid to drive. And he asked the wrong guy for it. And the likelihood is because Vic is sociable and he's been drinking. Come on, let's have another drink. All right, he goes in for whatever reason.
And when he goes inside, something goes very wrong.
Now, did Victor go into his saying the wrong thing, which he did when he drinks? What if he said something to Ron and made him mad? And Ron went off and grabbed a knife and hacked Victor to pieces with it in a moment of rage, because that's what Ron White is. Ron's a sociopath. And I think that's all there was to it. It was a moment in time for Ron White, and it ended Victor Woods' life.
Kenda has his man, but just how many other victims are out there?
We're going to charge you with this murder, Ron, another one. You're making a list. Who else have you killed? He didn't answer me, but he looked at me. And he smirked at me.
Ronald Lee White soon admits to shooting the hotel clerk in Pueblo, as well as his old roommate 3 years before.
White tells the investigators that he is an avid Star Trek fan. He prefers the old programs. He has a roommate, and the roommate wants to watch something else, just as he's prepared to watch his Star Trek program. So Ronald White shoots his roommate in the face with his .44 Magnum revolver because he was going to change that channel, and that's just not going to work.
They were going to be able to obtain the death penalty in Pueblo, and they wondered if we would incorporate our case with theirs in order to better ascertain that result. And so that's what we did on that case.
White eventually pleads guilty to the murders of Victor Woods, the hotel clerk, and White's roommate. He receives a life sentence without the possibility of parole. During his sentencing, White tells the judge that he had a hand in as many as 15 other murders.
We have the general idea of what a serial murderer might look like or whatever, and you look at Ronald Lee White and you think, here's somebody who I would walk past in the mall and never even think that he's somebody who could be so cold-blooded, who could have, maybe a half an hour before killed somebody and then be just walking down the street the next minute.
I thought that this guy was sick and that he should be put away forever. He took something that couldn't be given back. He had no regard for human life, and he would obviously do it again if need be.
Vic was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. This guy was going to probably kill somebody that night anyway, and it just so happened that they crossed paths.
Closure never happens for a victim's family. It just doesn't. I think many people can quietly take the pain. Some people cannot. I think the grief reaction varies widely. Some people can deal with it and some never do. I don't think anybody ever really does. There's something profoundly wrong about your child dying before you do. That's not the way of things. It's not supposed to be that way. And I don't think you recover from that. I don't.
When Vic was killed, it confused me and enraged me, and it was just one of those lessons in life that life just isn't fair. It isn't right. And things can happen at a moment's notice.
The call came in just after dawn, when the fog still clung to the hills like a held breath, when California in 2002 looked calm enough to believe nothing bad could happen there, and yet a voice on the line was already shaking, already saying the words no dispatcher ever forgets, already pulling a quiet community into a story that would refuse to end. A car. Abandoned. Driver missing. Engine cold. Door open. No blood, no struggle, no clear reason why a life would simply pause in the middle of a routine morning and never resume. It sounded small at first, almost ordinary, the kind of incident that gets cleared before lunch, but by nightfall it had a name, a face, and a weight that settled over the town like an incoming storm. The vehicle sat at the edge of a two-lane road, the kind that cuts through neighborhoods without really belonging to them, flanked by eucalyptus trees and cracked sidewalks. Inside, everything looked untouched. A coffee cup in the holder. A folded receipt on the passenger seat. The radio preset to a local station that would later run the victim's photo on repeat, asking anyone, everyone, to call in. The driver had been on their way somewhere familiar, somewhere close, and that detail alone unnerved investigators. People don't vanish on routes they know by heart. People don't leave cars like this unless something forces the decision, unless something unseen enters the frame. Neighbors were interviewed before the sun fully burned through the fog. Doors opened cautiously. Curtains twitched. No one had heard a scream. No one had seen a struggle. A few remembered a car slowing down. A shadow moving between the trees. A sound that could have been a door shutting, or just the morning wind. The kind of half-memories that grow sharper with time and less useful with every retelling. By afternoon, yellow tape fluttered where kids usually rode their bikes, and the phrase, cold case, had not yet been spoken, but it was already hovering, uninvited, in the background. The missing person was local, well-known enough to trigger unease, but private enough to leave gaps in the narrative. A routine life, by most accounts. Job, family, habits that followed a predictable rhythm. The last confirmed sighting placed them less than a mile from home. The last phone activity showed nothing alarming. No threats, no warnings, no dramatic farewell. That absence of drama became the most disturbing detail of all. Crimes that announce themselves are easier to chase. This one whispered and slipped away. Detectives worked the scene methodically, documenting tire marks that led nowhere, photographing footprints that blended into dozens of others, collecting fibers that could belong to anyone. Every object felt like it might be the key, and every hour that passed without answers tightened the knot in their stomachs. Search teams moved through nearby ravines and wooded patches, calling out a name that echoed back unanswered. Helicopters traced slow circles overhead. Dogs followed scents that dissolved into nothing. By the end of the first week, hope and dread existed side by side, equally exhausting. The community reacted the only way it knew how. Flyers went up on telephone poles and grocery store boards. Candlelight vigils formed at dusk, flames trembling in the coastal breeze as people stood close together, sharing rumors in low voices. Some said they'd seen a suspicious truck. Others insisted it had to be someone from outside, passing through, a stranger who vanished as quickly as they arrived. A few quietly wondered if the danger was closer, more familiar, and those thoughts went unspoken, heavy and unwelcome. Investigators traced the victims' recent days with microscopic attention. Bank records, work logs, casual conversations remembered too late. A co-worker recalled an argument that hadn't seemed important at the time. A neighbor mentioned a late-night visitor, details blurred by distance and darkness. Each lead flared briefly, then dimmed. The file thickened. The answers did not. With every dead end, the case lost heat, slipping from breaking news to background concern, from urgent alerts to quiet persistence. Weeks turned into months. The car was released from evidence, cleaned, returned to a family that barely recognized it anymore. Seasons changed. The road where it had been found returned to its ordinary rhythm, cars passing without slowing, drivers unaware of the question that still lingered there. Inside the police department, the case moved from active boards to long-term storage, though a few detectives refused to let it settle completely. They reread reports late at night, convinced something had been missed in the margins. The term cold case arrived without ceremony. It wasn't an announcement, just a shift in tone, a subtle lowering of expectations. Press coverage thinned. Tips slowed to a trickle, then to nothing. The victim's name stopped leading the broadcasts, and started appearing only in anniversaries, in brief segments that reopened wounds without offering relief. For the family, time did not soften anything. It only stretched the absence, turning it into a permanent fixture of daily life. Rumors evolved as facts stagnated. One version of events suggested a random act, a chance encounter gone wrong. Another painted a picture of careful planning, of someone who knew exactly where to intercept, when to strike, how to leave no trace. Online forums dissected grainy photos, enhanced shadows, circled nothing and called it evidence. Amateur theories multiplied, each one more certain than the last, none of them able to cross the line into proof. Years later, a new detective pulled the file, dust rising from the cardboard edges. Technology had changed. Methods had improved. What once seemed insignificant might now speak louder. Evidence was retested. Old interviews replayed. A witness statement, dismissed early on, began to look different under fresh eyes. The possibility of resolution flickered again, fragile but undeniable. The words "case reopened" circulated quietly, careful not to promise what history had taught everyone not to expect. And yet, for all the renewed effort, the center of the mystery remained hollow. No body. No definitive crime scene. No single moment that could be pointed to and declared the truth. Just a stretch of road, an empty car, and a life that stepped out of view. The community, older now, carried the story like a shared scar. Parents warned their children about that morning without fully explaining it. New residents heard whispers and asked questions that had no satisfying answers. By the time the case reached its 10th year, it had become part of local identity, a reference point for unease, a reminder that certainty is an illusion. Detectives retired. Family members aged. Memories faded in unpredictable ways, sometimes sharpening pain, sometimes erasing crucial details. The file remained, thicker than ever, heavier with time, waiting for a moment that might never come. Even now, the headline hangs in the air, provocative and unresolved, suggesting closure that reality has yet to deliver. California 2002 cold case solved, it promises, daring anyone to believe it. But beneath that line, beneath the bold type and dramatic phrasing, the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. A question unanswered. A morning that never reached its destination. And a silence that has learned how to endure. By the second year, the case no longer lived in the present tense. It existed in fragments, in remembered conversations that began with "back then," in police briefings that started with a sigh. The missing person's face was still taped to the inside of lockers at the station, edges curling, eyes staring out as if asking why time kept moving for everyone else. Detectives who had worked the case from the beginning spoke about it differently now, slower, more carefully, as if the wrong word might finally bury it for good. They knew the danger of routine, how unanswered cases can become furniture, always there, rarely examined. The road where the car had been found became a quiet obsession. Investigators returned to it again and again, at different hours, in different light. Morning sun revealed nothing new. Night brought only the hum of passing vehicles and the distant sound of wind through leaves. They measured sightlines, tested how quickly a car could pull over without drawing attention, how far someone could move into the trees before disappearing completely. It was all possible. Too possible. The location offered no resistance to theory, and that made it useless as proof. A new wave of interviews followed. People who had already told their stories were asked to tell them again, years later, memory scraping against memory. Details shifted. Times changed by minutes, sometimes hours. A truck that had once been white was now dark. A man seen near the road grew taller, then shorter, then vanished altogether. Detectives knew not to accuse witnesses of lying. Time does this on its own. It erodes certainty while convincing people they remember more clearly than ever. One detail refused to disappear. A brief phone call made days before the disappearance, to a number that no longer existed. The carrier had purged its records. The owner of the line was never identified. It could have been nothing, a wrong number, a telemarketer. Or it could have been the hinge on which everything turned. Investigators chased it anyway, contacting former providers, tracing billing addresses that led to empty lots and redeveloped buildings. Every path ended the same way, in absence. The family lived in a permanent state of suspended shock. Holidays arrived like intruders. Birthdays passed without celebration. They learned to answer questions from strangers with practiced calm, repeating facts they had long since memorized. Hope became something private, almost embarrassing, shared only in whispers. Publicly, they asked for answers. Privately, they negotiated with possibilities they never wanted to consider. The not knowing was its own form of grief, unrecognized and relentless. Media interest surged briefly when a similar disappearance occurred 2 counties away. The similarities were superficial but enough to spark speculation. Could there be a pattern? A predator? A series waiting to be named? Detectives compared notes, lined up timelines, matched methods that barely existed. Nothing solid emerged. The cases drifted apart, connected only by the public's need for symmetry, for explanations that make fear manageable. Inside the department, younger officers heard the story like a warning. Be careful. Pay attention to the quiet details. Don't assume tomorrow will fix what today can't. Veterans used the case as shorthand for humility. Proof that some answers refuse to be forced. That experience does not guarantee closure. It was spoken about late at night, over cold coffee, when confidence gave way to honesty. Evidence lockers were reorganized. Old boxes relabeled. The missing persons file was handled with extra care, as if rough treatment might erase what little remained. A piece of fabric recovered from the car was tested again, this time with more advanced techniques. The results were inconclusive, but even that felt like movement. Any result felt like movement. Stagnation was the enemy, more terrifying than bad news. Tips arrived sporadically, often triggered by dreams, arguments, or guilt that had fermented over years. Someone thought they remembered a scream after all. Someone else had a sudden certainty about a neighbor who moved away shortly after. Each call was logged, assessed, weighed against reality. Most collapsed under scrutiny. A few lingered, just long enough to raise heart rates, before dissolving into coincidence. The town itself changed. New businesses replaced old storefronts. Families moved in who had never heard of the case, then heard of it immediately. The story was passed along not as news but as law, something that defined the place in subtle ways. Parents walked their children a little farther. Drivers glanced at that stretch of road and felt an unnameable tension. The absence had become ambient. 5 years in, a private investigator approached the family with confidence and a theory. He spoke in absolutes, drew lines others had been afraid to draw. For a moment, belief surged. Meetings were held. Documents exchanged. Then the theory unraveled, undone by assumptions disguised as facts. The investigator disappeared from their lives as abruptly as he had entered, leaving behind nothing but exhaustion. Law enforcement revisited the victim's personal relationships with renewed intensity. Friendships were re-examined. Romantic entanglements scrutinized. Old disagreements were elevated to potential motives. It was uncomfortable, invasive, necessary. No one liked it. Some cooperated reluctantly. Others refused outright, offended by suspicion years after the fact. The investigation walked a thin line between diligence and desperation. A partial human remain found miles away sparked panic and anticipation in equal measure. For days, the community held its breath. The DNA results came back negative. Relief collided with despair. The unknown continued. Even bad certainty would have been easier than this endless maybe. As the decade mark approached, official language softened. Presumed. Likely. Words that acknowledged reality without confirming it. The case file included multiple timelines now, branching narratives that could not be reconciled. Each was plausible. None were provable. The missing person existed in a space between life and death, a limbo that stretched indefinitely. Then technology took another leap. Databases expanded. Genetic genealogy entered conversations once considered science fiction. Detectives who had refused to let the case die felt a cautious optimism. Old evidence was shipped to new labs. Results were awaited with the kind of tension usually reserved for verdicts. Days passed. Weeks. The answers, when they came, were again partial, suggestive but incomplete, enough to reopen doors but not walk through them. The community reacted with practiced restraint. They had been here before. Hope was rationed now, consumed carefully. Still, the word solved began to appear in conversations, always followed by hesitation, as if saying it too loudly might break whatever fragile progress had been made. The headline lingered, tempting and cruel. Through it all, one truth remained constant. A person had vanished into thin air on an ordinary morning. Not in a distant wilderness. Not in a place known for danger. But on a familiar road, under a familiar sky. The years had added layers of analysis, technology, and speculation, but they had not filled the central void. The silence at the heart of the case endured, patient, unyielding, waiting to see how much longer it would be allowed to keep its secrets. The first real crack in the case did not arrive with sirens or headlines. It slipped in quietly, buried inside a routine audit of old evidence, the kind of administrative task no one associates with breakthroughs. A technician noticed a discrepancy in a log entry, a timestamp that didn't align with the rest of the chain of custody. It wasn't proof of anything, just an inconsistency, but in a case built almost entirely on absence, even a small irregularity felt like pressure against a sealed door. Detectives leaned in. Files were reopened. A timeline long considered settled began to wobble. The item in question was mundane, a personal object recovered from the car, catalogued, bagged, forgotten. Back in 2002, it had yielded nothing useful. No prints worth chasing. No fibers that could be conclusively matched. Technology had moved on since then, and so had patience. The object was sent out again, this time to a lab that didn't exist when the case began. Weeks passed. The weight felt heavier than usual, as if everyone sensed that whatever came back would alter the shape of the story, even if it didn't finish it. While the lab worked, detectives turned inward, re-examining their own assumptions. Why had the car been found where it was? Why that road? Why that moment? The idea that the disappearance was random began to feel thin. Too many small choices lined up too neatly. Someone had known the victim's routine, or at least known enough to exploit it. That realization didn't narrow the field. It expanded it. Familiarity can come from many directions. Old interviews were replayed, not for what was said, but for what wasn't. Pauses. Deflections. Answers that arrived too quickly. One witness, barely noted in early reports, had placed themselves near the scene at a time that no longer made sense. Back then, it had seemed irrelevant. Now, it felt like a thread begging to be pulled. Detectives tracked the witness down, years older, life reshaped by time and distance. The second interview was tense. The story had changed. Not dramatically, but enough. Memory or motive? No one could say which. The lab results arrived without fanfare. A partial profile. Inconclusive on its own, but potentially powerful when combined with emerging databases. The room felt smaller as detectives absorbed the implications. This was not a solution. It was an invitation. They entered the data, expanded the search, watched as distant possibilities flickered into view. None were close enough to name. All were close enough to haunt. Word leaked, as it always does. The family heard about new developments before they heard details. It was enough to reopen wounds they had learned to live around. Hope surged, then immediately collided with fear. Progress meant answers. Answers meant endings. They had survived this long by existing between those two states. Choosing one felt like stepping into fire. The media returned cautiously, older now, more skeptical. Reporters asked better questions. They remembered the false starts, the premature optimism. Still, cameras appeared again at the edge of that familiar road. B-roll footage captured passing cars, rustling trees, the illusion of normalcy. Headlines used words like breakthrough without committing to what that meant. Viewers leaned in, hungry for resolution, unaware of how fragile the moment was. Inside the investigation, pressure mounted. Every new step risked public disappointment. Every delay risked internal collapse. Detectives argued more openly now. Some believed the case needed radical reframing. Others insisted the truth was already in the file, overlooked but present. The tension wasn't personal. It was structural. A reflection of how long everyone had been carrying the same unanswered question. Another lead emerged from an unexpected place. A financial record, re-examined with modern software, revealed a transaction that hadn't stood out before. Small. Ordinary. Out of character only in hindsight. It suggested a meeting. Or preparation. Or nothing at all. Investigators traced it anyway, following a paper trail through closed businesses, and changed ownership. At the end was a name that appeared elsewhere in the file, barely noticeable until now. A coincidence became a pattern. A pattern demanded attention. The person in question had never been a suspect. They were adjacent, peripheral, always one step removed. Someone who knew the area. Knew the routines. Had a reason to be nearby without raising alarms. When detectives approached, the response was polite, cooperative, almost eager. Too eager, some thought. Statements were given. Alibis offered. Everything seemed to check out, until it didn't. Small inconsistencies surfaced, nothing definitive, just enough to keep the spotlight fixed. Surveillance followed, discreet and limited by time. There was no dramatic reveal, no sudden confession. Just a growing sense that the truth was closer now, uncomfortably close, like a reflection you don't recognize until it moves differently than you do. Detectives balanced persistence with restraint. Push too hard, and whatever they were circling might slip away again. As months passed, the investigation took on a new rhythm. Faster, sharper, more focused. The case no longer felt like a ghost. It felt like a living thing, reactive, aware. Each move produced a response, subtle but undeniable. Phone calls returned more quickly. Lawyers appeared where none had been before. Silence, once pervasive, became selective. The community watched from a distance, uncertain how to engage. This wasn't the open mystery they had grown used to. It was something more delicate, more volatile. Conversations shifted from speculation to quiet observation. People paid attention to details they had ignored for years. Who avoided eye contact? Who suddenly seemed nervous when the case came up? The story, once abstract, felt personal again. Then came the delay. A procedural obstacle. A warrant held up by technicalities. Momentum stalled. Frustration boiled over behind closed doors. Detectives feared losing the thread, feared that time would again become the enemy. The person they were watching remained just out of reach, insulated by rules that existed for good reason, but felt cruel in this context. During the pause, doubt crept back in. What if this was another mirage? Another almost. The file was full of those. Investigators reminded themselves that caution was not failure. That patience had kept the case alive this long. Still, sleep came harder. The weight of expectation pressed in from all sides. When the warrant finally came through, it did not deliver the catharsis everyone had imagined. Searches were conducted. Items collected. Statements refined. The evidence added texture, context, but not closure. The case shifted again, narrowing, sharpening, refusing to resolve neatly. And yet, something had changed. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, expectant. The missing person's name resurfaced in daily briefings, spoken with a confidence that hadn't existed in years. The possibility of an ending, whatever shape it might take, no longer felt theoretical. The headline continued to haunt the edges of the story, bold and premature. California 2002 cold case solved. A declaration waiting for permission. The truth, still incomplete, hovered just beyond reach, close enough to feel, distant enough to deny. The case had survived neglect, doubt, and time itself. Now it faced its most dangerous moment yet. The moment when answers begin to form, and the cost of getting them becomes impossible to ignore. The search warrant changed the temperature of the case, not because it delivered clarity, but because it confirmed suspicion had teeth. Doors that had been closed for years were opened under fluorescent light. Drawers were emptied. Digital histories were mirrored and frozen in time. Nothing screamed guilt, and that was the problem. Crimes that age well learn how to hide inside normality. They camouflage themselves in routines, in objects that look like every other object, in data that only becomes meaningful when you already know what you're looking for. Detectives catalogued everything, resisting the urge to assign meaning too quickly. A jacket folded too neatly. A tool cleaned too thoroughly. A phone that had been reset more times than necessary. Each detail hovered between innocent and incriminating, balanced on context that still hadn't fully assembled itself. They worked in silence, aware that mistakes at this stage wouldn't just delay justice, they might erase it altogether. The person at the center of this tightening circle maintained composure. Publicly cooperative. Privately guarded. Interviews became longer, more precise, designed to exhaust consistency rather than challenge it outright. The same questions were asked in different orders, on different days, by different voices. Minor discrepancies emerged, then retreated when confronted. It was like chasing a reflection in glass, always visible, never touchable. Meanwhile, the lab results continued to trickle in, one piece at a time. A fiber that matched a common material, but an uncommon source. Soil composition consistent with multiple locations, but strongly aligned with one. None of it was definitive alone. Together, it began to suggest movement. A path. A story that could be told if enough fragments aligned. The case, once static, now felt dynamic, responsive, as if aware it was being watched closely again. The family was briefed carefully, shielded from speculation, but not from truth. They were told progress was being made, that the case was active in a way it hadn't been for years. They nodded, thanked everyone, went home, and sat with the familiar dread of anticipation. They had learned that hope could be dangerous. That every step forward risked reopening grief they had carefully compartmentalized just to survive. The media sensed blood in the water. Requests for comment multiplied. Old footage was recycled. The missing person's face, younger now than the people remembering it, filled screens again. Pundits debated theories with renewed confidence, mistaking momentum for resolution. Investigators avoided cameras, aware that spectacle could poison precision. This wasn't a story anymore. It was a balancing act. A second witness, overlooked for years, came forward after seeing the renewed coverage. Their memory had sharpened with age, or perhaps guilt had finally outweighed fear. They spoke of a vehicle seen near the abandoned car that morning, idling longer than necessary. Of a figure standing too still. The description was vague, frustratingly so, but it aligned with something buried deep in the file. A note scribbled in the margin of an early report. A detail dismissed as unreliable at the time. Now it resurfaced, demanding re-evaluation. Detectives reconstructed the morning minute by minute, layering old data with new interpretation. Traffic patterns. Cell tower pings. Weather reports. They discovered gaps where assumptions had once lived. The timeline shifted subtly but significantly. The window of opportunity widened. The suspect pool adjusted accordingly. It wasn't about proving someone could have done it anymore. It was about proving someone couldn't have not done it. Pressure mounted inside the department. Resources were reallocated. Supervisors wanted results. Prosecutors wanted something they could stand in front of a jury with, something that wouldn't crumble under cross-examination. The investigators felt the tension acutely. They had chased this case for years, often in isolation. Now that it mattered again, the weight was heavier than ever. Then came the setback. A key piece of evidence, long assumed to be admissible, was challenged on procedural grounds. A technicality, buried in a decades-old policy, threatened to erase it entirely. Meetings stretched late into the night. Voices were raised, then lowered. The past reached forward, reminding everyone that time doesn't just obscure truth, it complicates it. While lawyers argued, detectives returned to the human element. Motive, opportunity, behavior. They mapped relationships with obsessive detail, charting intersections that once seemed trivial. A shared acquaintance. A recurring location. A favor exchanged years before the disappearance that suddenly looked transactional. The web tightened, threads crossing in ways that felt less like coincidence and more like design. Surveillance logs revealed subtle changes in routine. A sudden trip taken without explanation. A phone call ended abruptly when certain topics arose. Nothing illegal. Nothing overt. But enough to suggest awareness. Enough to suggest that someone else, besides the investigators, was thinking very carefully about the past. The community felt the shift too. Conversations grew quieter. Speculation narrowed. Names were spoken less freely. People remembered things they hadn't allowed themselves to remember before. An argument overheard. A look exchanged. The case, once a distant mystery, pressed uncomfortably close to home. The idea that the answer might involve someone familiar unsettled more than any stranger ever could. As the evidence stack grew, so did the fear of being wrong. Investigators questioned each other relentlessly. They tested theories against worst-case scenarios. They imagined the defense's arguments before they were ever spoken. This was no longer about solving a puzzle. It was about surviving the consequences of being right. A breakthrough came, quietly, in the form of corroboration. Two independent details, sourced years apart, aligned with uncanny precision. Separately, they meant little. Together, they formed a hinge point. A moment where possibility tipped toward probability. The room fell silent as detectives realized what they were looking at. No one celebrated. Celebration would come later, if at all. The case was no longer cold. It was fragile. One misstep could shatter it. The word solved still waited in the wings, bold and tempting, but no one dared speak it yet. Not aloud. Not even in thought. Because everyone in that room understood something the headlines never do. Resolution is not an event. It's a process. And this one was far from over. The hinge point changed everything, even though it didn't look like much on paper. Two details, separated by years and circumstances, now sat side by side, impossible to ignore. One came from a witness statement given early on, half dismissed, because it contradicted the prevailing theory at the time. The other surfaced in a digital archive no one had thought to revisit, buried under layers of outdated formatting and forgotten passwords. Together, they suggested presence. Not just opportunity, but proximity. Not just knowledge, but timing. Detectives rebuilt the timeline again, this time with ruthless precision. The margin for error narrowed to minutes. The disappearance was no longer a broad window of uncertainty, it was a sharp interval, tightly defined, unforgiving. When they overlaid movements, calls, and sightings, one figure kept appearing at the edges, never centered, never absent. Always explainable. Always justifiable. Until the explanations began to overlap in ways that felt rehearsed. Interviews resumed, more focused now, less patient. The tone shifted from exploratory to confirmatory. Investigators weren't fishing anymore. They were testing. The person of interest sensed it immediately. Answers grew more careful, more legalistic. Pauses lengthened. Eye contact broke at unexpected moments. Still, nothing crossed the line into confession or contradiction. The dance continued, intricate and exhausting. A former acquaintance was brought in, someone who had stayed silent for years out of fear or loyalty or sheer exhaustion. Time had loosened their grip. They spoke cautiously, measuring each word, aware of the consequences. They described a conversation from long ago, one that hadn't seemed important then. A remark about that road. About routines. About how easy it would be for someone to disappear there. At the time, it had sounded like idle speculation. Now it sounded like rehearsal. The statement was not enough to stand alone. It needed support. Detectives searched for it obsessively, cross-referencing old notes, scanning for echoes. They found one, faint but undeniable, in a report written by an officer who had since retired. A single sentence, underlined twice, never followed up on. It matched the phrasing almost exactly. Two voices, years apart, saying the same thing without knowing the other existed. The realization settled slowly. This was no longer about whether a crime had occurred. That question had been answered long ago by absence itself. This was about intent. About planning. About the uncomfortable truth that the disappearance may not have been spontaneous at all. The case shifted from mystery to menace, and that distinction changed how everyone felt carrying it. Prosecutors were briefed again, this time with a different energy. They asked harder questions, pushed back more aggressively. They demanded to know what could be proven, not what felt true. Detectives welcomed the resistance. Better to have the fight now than in front of a jury. Weak points were exposed. Gaps acknowledged. Strategies adjusted. The case was being forged under pressure, not polished for display. Another lab result arrived, this one delayed by months of backlog and bureaucratic inertia. It didn't identify anyone outright. It did something more dangerous. It excluded people. Alibis that had once seemed solid began to collapse under the weight of new exclusionary data. The circle tightened again, not dramatically, but inexorably. Fewer options. Fewer exits. The family was told less now, not out of secrecy, but caution. Every word carried weight. Every update risked misinterpretation. They sensed the shift anyway. Detectives spoke differently. Meetings felt heavier. The long-standing ambiguity that had defined their lives began to thin, replaced by a sharper, more painful anticipation. Knowing was closer. And knowing, they understood, would not be gentle. Outside the investigation, the town buzzed quietly. Not with gossip, but with restraint. People sensed that something serious was unfolding, something that demanded silence rather than speculation. The case had matured. It was no longer entertainment, no longer rumor. It was a reckoning approaching at an uneven pace. Then came the moment everyone dreaded. A decision point. Investigators believed they were close enough to act, but not close enough to guarantee success. Move too soon, and risk losing everything. Wait too long, and risk losing the suspect. Surveillance indicated agitation. Routines changed. Communication patterns shifted. Someone was preparing for something, though no one could say what. Late one night, a meeting stretched into the early hours. Evidence boards glowed under harsh light. Coffee went untouched. The room was quiet except for the low hum of equipment and the occasional sigh. Each person there understood the stakes. Years of work balanced on judgment calls measured in inches. They decided to wait, just a little longer. To gather one more piece. To close one more gap. It was a gamble, but so was everything else in this case. Patience had kept it alive this long. Maybe it would carry them the rest of the way. As dawn approached, the road where it all began lay empty again, fog rolling in like memory, hiding and revealing in equal measure. The disappearance still owned that place, still whispered from the margins. But now, for the first time in years, it felt like the whisper was answering back. Waiting became an act of discipline rather than hesitation. Every instinct told them to move, to press, to force the truth into daylight, but instinct had been wrong before. Time, once the enemy, was now a tool, if they knew how to wield it. Surveillance continued quietly, almost invisibly, woven into the background of ordinary days. The person at the center of it all lived their life in public, went to work, ran errands, exchanged pleasantries, unaware, or pretending to be unaware, that every movement was being logged, every deviation noted. Patterns began to fracture. Routes changed without explanation. Familiar places were avoided. Phones went dark for hours at a time, then reappeared with careful, minimal activity. It wasn't panic. It was calculation. The kind that comes from someone who understands risk and believes they can still manage it. Detectives watched, resisting the urge to read too much into each shift, but the accumulation told its own story. Something was tightening, on both sides. In the background, analysts revisited one of the oldest questions in the case: what actually happened in the first moments after the disappearance? Not the broad narrative, but the physical reality. Where the victim would have stood. How quickly a confrontation could escalate. How long it would take for someone to be moved, willingly or otherwise, out of sight. They ran scenarios, not as speculation, but as constraint. Eliminating impossibilities. Defining what must have been true, regardless of motive or identity. One scenario kept resurfacing. Brief. Controlled. Almost silent. It explained the lack of witnesses, the absence of obvious struggle, the eerie stillness of the scene. It suggested familiarity. Trust, even if momentary. The kind of trust that lowers defenses, just long enough for everything to go wrong. The theory settled over the room like a cold realization. If this was right, then the crime hadn't been chaotic. It had been efficient. That efficiency haunted the detectives who had been there in 2002, the ones who remembered the early days, the confusion, the sense that something was off, but couldn't be articulated. They saw it now, with the clarity of distance. The case hadn't gone cold because there were no clues. It had gone cold because the clues pointed somewhere too close, too uncomfortable to fully confront at the time. A new warrant was requested, narrower this time, more precise. It targeted data rather than objects, histories rather than spaces. Approval took longer than expected. Every delay felt like a test of resolve. When it finally came through, the results were slow, methodical, devastating in their subtlety. Deleted records weren't gone. They were layered, fragmented, recoverable. Not everything. But enough. One recovered fragment placed the person of interest in proximity to the scene at a time they had long denied. Not directly. Not conclusively. But close enough to puncture the story they had been telling for years. Detectives didn't rush in. They let the information sit, let it breathe, let it interact with everything else they had gathered. Pressure, when applied too quickly, can scatter fragile truths. The next interview was different. The room felt smaller. The questions sharper. The answers came slower now, weighed down by the knowledge that something had shifted. The person across the table noticed it. People always do. They asked what had changed. They were told nothing had. That was the cruelest part. The truth had changed everything without announcing itself. A pause stretched between questions. Silence filled the gaps where certainty used to live. At one point, a simple question, "Where were you, exactly?" produced a response that contradicted an earlier statement by a matter of blocks. It could have been a mistake. It could have been fatigue. It could have been the beginning of collapse. Detectives marked it, gently, and moved on. Outside, the case pressed back into public consciousness. Not loudly. Not yet. But enough to unsettle. Local journalists sensed movement, though official channels offered nothing. Social media filled the vacuum with speculation, some of it wildly inaccurate, some uncomfortably close. Investigators avoided the noise, but they couldn't escape its effects. Witnesses grew nervous. Old acquaintances reconsidered their silence. One such acquaintance reached out anonymously, then withdrew, then reached out again. When they finally agreed to speak, their voice carried the strain of someone reopening a door they had spent years barricading. They didn't offer a confession. They offered context. A memory of tension. Of an argument that ended without resolution. Of a threat phrased as a joke. The kind of thing people dismiss, until hindsight sharpens it into something else. That account didn't add a new suspect. It deepened an existing one. It added weight where there had already been pressure. Detectives cross-checked the details, aligning them with known facts. The fit wasn't perfect, but it was close enough to matter. Close enough to justify the next step. Behind closed doors, prosecutors began drafting potential charges, carefully, conditionally. No commitments. Just frameworks. What could be argued? What would be challenged? What a jury might believe, after hearing years of delay explained as diligence rather than failure. It was a delicate exercise, balancing truth with survivability. The family was brought in again, this time with fewer caveats. They were told that the investigation had reached a critical phase. That answers were closer than they had ever been. That nothing was guaranteed. They listened, hands folded, eyes tired. They had learned to exist inside that uncertainty. But something in the tone told them this was different. Not hopeful. Serious. As weeks passed, the person under scrutiny grew more erratic. Friends noticed. Colleagues noticed. Small cracks appeared in the carefully maintained facade. Missed appointments. Sudden defensiveness. A visible strain that contradicted years of calm denial. None of it was illegal. All of it was human. And humans, under pressure, reveal patterns they don't realize they are repeating. Detectives debated timing again. The window was narrowing. Evidence was aligning, but alignment is not certainty. They weighed the risk of waiting against the risk of acting. The case had already survived 20 years. It deserved precision more than haste. Still, the sense that something was about to break grew stronger by the day. Late one evening, a call came in from a lab supervisor. A retest had finished early. The result was not definitive, not the kind of evidence that ends debates. But it was corroborative. It didn't stand alone. It stood with everything else. A quiet reinforcement of a direction they were already moving in. The room didn't erupt. There were no raised voices, no sudden relief. Just a collective exhale. A recognition that the path forward was now clearer, even if the destination remained out of sight. The case, once defined by what it lacked, was beginning to define itself by what it contained. Out on that familiar road, traffic flowed as it always had, indifferent to the history embedded in the asphalt. Fog rolled in and burned off again, repeating the rhythm of that first morning. The disappearance still lingered there, unresolved, but no longer untouchable. The silence that had protected it for so long was thinning. And somewhere between past and present, between certainty and doubt, the truth was starting to feel the pressure of being found. The pressure didn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It accumulated, quietly, relentlessly, until the case felt like it was breathing on its own. Every new piece of information interacted with the others, creating friction, heat, momentum. Detectives began to speak in shorter sentences, decisions compressed by the understanding that whatever happened next would define the outcome, one way or another. There was no going back to ambiguity after this. The line had been crossed. A final review of the timeline exposed something that had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades. A gap not where the victim vanished, but where the suspect's story lost cohesion. Not a dramatic hole, just a subtle drift, minutes that couldn't be accounted for without contradiction. In isolation, it meant nothing. In context, it was devastating. Those minutes sat precisely where the disappearance required silence, control, and access. The realization landed slowly, heavy and unavoidable. Detectives reconstructed those minutes again, this time with brutal honesty. No assumptions. No benefit of the doubt. They asked the most uncomfortable question of all: what if the truth had been visible from the start, but no one was ready to see it? The answer didn't bring relief. It brought anger. Not at a person, but at time itself, at the way certainty erodes when urgency fades. Another interview was scheduled, framed as routine, designed to feel familiar. The room was the same. The chairs hadn't moved. The questions, however, were different. Not broader, but narrower, precise to the point of claustrophobia. The suspect sensed it immediately. Their posture stiffened. Their tone shifted. Familiar defenses rose too early, answering questions that hadn't yet been asked. The detectives let the silence work. They let the contradictions surface naturally, one by one, stacking gently but visibly. A location placed too far away. A call remembered too clearly. A detail volunteered without prompting. Each misstep was small, almost forgivable, but together they began to outline a shape that could no longer be ignored. The interview ended without resolution, but it didn't need one. The damage had been done. Outside that room, the case accelerated. Warrants were amended. Data was cross-checked in real time. Analysts worked through the night, layering maps, records, and recovered fragments until the margins disappeared. What emerged wasn't a single smoking gun, but a convergence. Independent lines of evidence pointing in the same direction, reinforcing each other, reducing coincidence to implausibility. The prosecutors returned, no longer cautious observers, but active participants. They pressed for clarity, for narratives that could survive scrutiny. Detectives responded with timelines that held under pressure, with explanations grounded in behavior rather than speculation. The conversation shifted from if to how. How to proceed. How to present. How to account for 20 years of silence without letting it become the defense's strongest weapon. The family was not shielded anymore. They were told that an arrest was possible. Not guaranteed. Possible. The word hung in the air, fragile and terrifying. They asked questions they had rehearsed for years, questions about what comes next, about what knowing would change, about whether answers could ever feel like justice. No one lied to them. No one promised relief. The town felt it too, that subtle tightening before impact. Law enforcement vehicles appeared more frequently, more deliberately. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. People revisited memories they had filed away as irrelevant. The idea that the truth might involve someone woven into daily life unsettled deeply held assumptions about safety and familiarity. Then came the complication no one wanted. The suspect retained new legal counsel, aggressive and experienced, the kind that signals awareness of imminent risk. Statements were rescinded. Cooperation narrowed. Communication funneled through attorneys. The window began to close. Detectives knew this phase well. It meant the informal path was over. Everything now would have to stand on its own. A decision was made, not lightly, not unanimously. Enough was enough. The evidence would never be perfect. It would never be complete. But perfection is not the standard. Proof beyond reasonable doubt is. And that threshold, after years of careful assembly, finally appeared within reach. The arrest was planned with restraint. No spectacle. No early morning raid designed for cameras. Just a controlled approach, designed to preserve dignity and prevent mistakes. When the moment came, it unfolded quietly. A name spoken. Rights read. Hands placed where they could be seen. The street remained calm. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, unsure of what they were witnessing, sensing significance without context. The suspect did not resist. There was no outburst, no collapse. Just a long pause, a look that flickered between resignation and calculation. The kind of look that suggests awareness of consequence, not necessarily acceptance of guilt. The vehicle drove away. The street returned to silence, but it was a different silence now, charged with aftermath. News broke within hours. Carefully worded. Conditional. Arrest made in connection with 2002 disappearance. The word solved remained conspicuously absent. Commentators filled the gap, some cautiously optimistic, others openly skeptical. The community oscillated between relief and dread, understanding that an arrest is not an ending, only a transition. Inside the department, there was no celebration. Just exhaustion. Years of restraint finally released into quiet acknowledgement. The case file, once a monument to uncertainty, was now a living document again, moving toward judgment. But even as the process advanced, detectives understood the truth they rarely say out loud. An arrest does not answer every question. It does not restore what was taken. It does not rewind time. It simply forces the silence to respond. And for the first time since that foggy morning in 2002, the silence had been challenged. The arrest didn't bring quiet. It brought noise of a different kind, sharper, more intrusive, filling the spaces that had been occupied by uncertainty for 20 years. Sirens weren't necessary, the story moved faster than sound. Phones lit up across the town. Messages spread in fragments, half-facts stitched together by emotion. A name circulated, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken too loudly, as if volume could turn suspicion into certainty. In the hours that followed, investigators returned to the beginning, not to question what they had done, but to fortify it. Every report was reread. Every timestamp verified. The case was no longer just an investigation. It was an argument, one that would soon be tested in a courtroom where doubt is currency and memory is fragile. What had felt solid in private now had to survive public scrutiny. The suspect sat in a holding cell, alone with time in a way they hadn't been in years. There was no statement. No denial. No confession. Just silence, carefully maintained, legally reinforced. Attorneys moved quickly, filing motions designed to narrow the scope, to fracture the narrative before it could fully form. They attacked the timeline. The delay. The reliance on circumstantial alignment. They used the years like a shield, suggesting contamination, erosion, bias. Time, once the enemy of the investigation, now became its most dangerous opponent. Detectives anticipated it. They had built the case with that in mind, layering independent sources, avoiding reliance on any single moment or witness. Still, the pressure intensified. Every decision made over 2 decades was suddenly relevant. Every missed opportunity, every discarded lead, every assumption now faced the harsh light of hindsight. The case was strong, but it was not invulnerable. The family learned the suspect's name at the same time as the public. There was no relief in it. Names don't fill absence. Faces don't answer questions. They listened as reporters speculated, as commentators debated guilt and innocence with the confidence of distance. To them, the arrest was not a conclusion. It was an opening. A doorway to truths they had both sought and feared. Preliminary hearings approached, bringing with them a controlled release of information. Details long withheld entered the public record. The abandoned car. The shifting timelines. The recovered data. Each revelation recontextualized the story people thought they knew. Some felt betrayed by how close the truth had apparently been. Others resisted the idea entirely, clinging to earlier narratives that felt safer, simpler. The community split quietly. Not into camps, but into moods. Some wanted accountability, eager to believe that the mystery was finally ending. Others recoiled, unsettled by the possibility that someone they had known, trusted, passed on the street, could be responsible. The discomfort was personal now. No longer abstract. No longer distant. Inside the prosecution's office, strategy hardened. They focused on behavior, not drama. On patterns, not speculation. The absence of a body loomed over everything, a gap that could not be filled, only framed. They would argue that disappearance itself was evidence, that the silence spoke louder than any single object ever could. It was a risky position, but one grounded in the totality of what had been uncovered. The defense countered with inevitability. People disappear, they said. Lives fracture. Evidence degrades. Memories lie. They questioned motives, highlighted inconsistencies, reframed proximity as coincidence. They spoke calmly, confidently, planting doubt wherever certainty tried to grow. This was their terrain, and they navigated it with practiced ease. As the case moved forward, investigators revisited the road again, not for evidence, but for perspective. They stood where the car had once sat, imagined the morning as it must have unfolded, not in cinematic detail, but in practical reality. No drama. No warning. Just a moment where choices narrowed and consequence took over. The simplicity of it was the most unsettling part. The suspect's behavior in custody became a quiet point of interest. No outbursts. No visible fear. Just careful compliance. It unsettled those who expected cracks, expected humanity to surface under pressure. Instead, there was control. The same control detectives believed had defined that morning in 2002. Whether it was guilt or temperament remained unanswered. Media attention surged and stabilized, settling into a steady hum of updates and analysis. Each development was dissected, debated, reinterpreted. The case became content, stripped of its weight by repetition. Investigators avoided watching. The family couldn't avoid hearing it. The story followed them everywhere, relentless, indifferent to their need for space. As hearings progressed, one thing became clear. Even if the case ended in conviction, it would not end the story. Too many questions remained. Where had the victim gone? What had been done? Why nothing had ever been found? Justice, if it came, would be partial at best. Symbolic, not restorative. The word solved appeared more frequently now, bold and confident, as if repetition could will it into truth. Detectives resisted it. They knew better. Solved implies completeness. Closure. This case offered neither. It offered accountability, perhaps. An answer to who, maybe. But the how and the where remained locked behind silence. As the legal process ground forward, the town adjusted again, absorbing the shock, recalibrating its sense of normal. The road remained unchanged. The trees still moved with the wind. Cars still passed without slowing. Only the meaning had shifted. What was once a question mark had become a cautionary symbol. And beneath it all, the absence persisted. The missing person remained missing. No arrest could change that. No verdict could rewrite the years that followed that morning. The case had moved closer to resolution, but resolution, everyone was learning, is not the same as peace. The silence had finally been challenged, yes. But it had not yet spoken. Time inside the legal system moved differently, stretched thin and reshaped by procedure. Days passed without visible change, then everything shifted at once. Motions were filed, challenged, revised. Arguments unfolded in language stripped of emotion, designed to carve certainty out of doubt. For the first time since the arrest, the case slowed, not from lack of momentum, but from the gravity of consequence. Every step now carried weight that could not be undone. Detectives watched from the margins as their work transformed into exhibits and testimony outlines. What had once been instinct and intuition was now measured in admissibility and phrasing. They learned which details mattered to a jury and which, no matter how compelling, would never leave the conference room. It was a humbling process. Truth and proof do not always align neatly, and this case had lived too long in the space between them. One of the most fragile pillars of the prosecution's case came under early attack. The reconstructed timeline, refined over years of analysis, was challenged as speculative. The defense argued that reconstruction is not reality, that filling gaps invites bias. They framed the investigation as a story built backward from a desired conclusion. The implication was clear. If you assume guilt, everything looks like confirmation. The prosecution responded with restraint. They emphasized convergence. Independent lines of evidence arriving at the same point without coordination. Witnesses who had never spoken to each other describing the same behavior. Data recovered years apart aligning with uncanny precision. This wasn't a story, they argued. It was an accumulation. A slow narrowing of possibility, until only one explanation remained plausible. The absence of physical remains hovered over every exchange like a specter. The defense returned to it repeatedly, invoking it as the ultimate reasonable doubt. No body. No confirmed crime scene. No direct evidence of violence. They suggested alternate explanations, some far-fetched, others disturbingly mundane. A voluntary disappearance. An accident undiscovered. A new life begun elsewhere. Each theory strained credulity, but none could be definitively disproven. The family listened to these arguments with quiet endurance. Each alternative explanation felt like a reopening of wounds, an invitation to imagine suffering in new forms. They had lived with uncertainty for 2 decades. Hearing it weaponized was a different kind of pain. Still, they remained present, day after day, bearing witness not just to the case, but to the process that would decide its fate. As preliminary hearings unfolded, one witness after another took the stand, their words filtered through years of memory and preparation. Some spoke with confidence, others with visible strain. A few broke down, surprised by the emotional force of revisiting moments they had long buried. The defense questioned their reliability. The prosecution contextualized their imperfections. Human memory, both sides agreed, is flawed. The question was whether its collective weight could still carry truth. One witness, long considered marginal, emerged as unexpectedly significant. Not because of what they claimed to see, but because of when they claimed to see it. Their testimony bridged a gap that had troubled investigators for years, offering a plausible explanation for movement during a critical window. It didn't resolve the case. It steadied it. Sometimes, stability is enough. Outside the courtroom, public opinion oscillated. Headlines swung between confidence and caution. Talk shows debated ethics and evidence. Social media reduced complexity to slogans. The case became a mirror, reflecting whatever fears or beliefs people brought to it. Some saw institutional failure redeemed by persistence. Others saw overreach disguised as justice. The truth, as always, was more complicated. The suspect remained silent, their presence in the courtroom controlled, observant. They took notes occasionally, leaned toward their attorneys, avoided eye contact with the gallery. There was no visible remorse, no visible defiance. Just a careful neutrality that frustrated observers looking for emotional cues. But emotion, the court reminded everyone, is not evidence. Behind the scenes, negotiations were discussed, then dismissed. A plea would require acknowledgement. An acknowledgement would require something the defense was not prepared to offer. The prosecution weighed its options. A trial would be risky, lengthy, emotionally draining. But compromise felt like betrayal, not just of the victim, but of the years spent assembling the truth piece by piece. As the case edged closer to trial, one final complication surfaced. A previously unknown witness, located through a late-breaking tip, claimed to have relevant information. Their account was fragmentary, shaped by time and uncertainty, but it intersected with known facts in unsettling ways. The prosecution faced a choice. Introduce the testimony and risk destabilizing the narrative, or leave it aside and risk accusations of omission. They chose transparency. The witness was vetted, interviewed, cross-checked. Their story held just enough to matter. It suggested aftermath. Not the disappearance itself, but what followed. Movement after the fact. Decisions made under pressure. It didn't identify a location. It didn't provide closure. But it deepened the picture, adding dimension to a crime that had long seemed flat, defined only by absence. The defense moved to exclude the testimony, citing unreliability and prejudice. The judge listened carefully, asked pointed questions, weighed the balance between probative value and risk. The ruling allowed limited inclusion. A narrow window. A reminder that even now, the case existed on the edge of acceptability, vulnerable to collapse if pushed too far. Detectives felt the strain acutely. They had done everything they could within the limits of time and law. Watching the case pivot on legal nuance rather than investigative effort was both necessary and maddening. This was the price of due process. This was the only way the outcome could matter. The town adjusted again, learning to live with the case as an active presence rather than a historical mystery. People chose sides quietly, or avoided the topic altogether. Familiar places took on new meaning. The road where the car had been found was mentioned less often now, as if its significance had migrated elsewhere, into courtrooms and transcripts and sworn statements. As jury selection loomed, the question everyone avoided became impossible to ignore. What if this failed? What if the evidence, so carefully assembled, proved insufficient in the face of doubt? The prosecution prepared for that possibility, knowing it would not erase the truth they believed they had uncovered, but it would define how the story ended publicly. The family prepared too, in their own way. They tempered expectations, braced for disappointment, reminded themselves that the arrest alone had changed something fundamental. The silence had been challenged. The narrative had shifted. Even if the outcome fell short of justice, it would not revert to ignorance. The word solved continued to circulate, bold and declarative, detached from the complexity unfolding beneath it. Those closest to the case knew better. Solved is a headline. Resolution is a process. And this process was still moving, still fragile, still unresolved. As the courtroom lights dimmed at the end of another long day, the absence at the heart of the case remained. No body. No final answer. Just a convergence of evidence pressing toward a verdict that would decide not only guilt or innocence, but whether persistence could overcome time itself. The silence had been cornered. Now it would have to withstand judgment. Jury selection stripped the case of abstraction and gave it faces. Ordinary people pulled into an extraordinary decision. They listened as the outline of the disappearance was read aloud, some for the first time, others recognizing fragments they'd absorbed through years of headlines. Questions were asked about bias, about memory, about whether time itself could be trusted. Some jurors were dismissed because they already believed too strongly. Others because they doubted everything. What remained was a fragile balance, 12 people asked to carry the weight of 2 decades. Opening statements arrived without theatrics. The prosecution spoke calmly, deliberately, framing the case not as a mystery, but as a narrowing of possibilities. They did not promise answers to every question. They promised coherence. A sequence of actions. A pattern of behavior. A disappearance that could not be explained by chance or choice. The defense followed with restraint of its own, emphasizing the absence of finality, reminding the jury that suspicion is not proof, that time corrodes truth, that doubt is not failure but protection. Witnesses took the stand in a steady rhythm, each adding a layer, none delivering the kind of revelation television had trained people to expect. The abandoned car. The early searches. The missed connections. The overlooked details. It was cumulative, methodical, almost exhausting. Jurors took notes, glancing up when something resonated, down again when it blurred. The case demanded attention, not excitement. When investigators testified, they spoke about process more than intuition. About why certain leads were followed and others weren't. About mistakes acknowledged and corrected. About how technology had changed what was possible. The defense pressed them on delays, on assumptions, on moments when certainty had been deferred. The answers were honest, sometimes uncomfortably so. The truth of the investigation was not perfection, but persistence. The timeline became the spine of the trial. Charts were displayed. Movements traced. Calls plotted. The critical window was revisited again and again, viewed from different angles, stress-tested by cross-examination. The prosecution argued inevitability. The defense argued coincidence. Jurors watched as the same minutes were stretched, compressed, reframed, learning how perspective can alter meaning without changing fact. Then came the witness whose testimony bridged the gap. The courtroom felt different that day, quieter, more attentive. Their voice wavered at first, steadied as memory took over. They described seeing something ordinary in isolation, unsettling in context. Not a crime. Not a confrontation. Just presence where presence should not have been. The defense challenged credibility, suggested reconstruction, questioned motivation. The witness held, imperfect but consistent. It was enough to matter. Expert testimony followed, dense and technical, explaining data recovery, behavioral analysis, pattern recognition. The language was careful, designed to educate rather than persuade. Jurors asked questions. Clarifications were offered. Nothing was oversold. The prosecution avoided the temptation to declare certainty where none existed. Instead, they returned to the idea of convergence. Many weak signals aligning into one strong conclusion. The defense countered with experts of their own, dismantling assumptions, offering alternate interpretations, emphasizing margins of error. They reminded the jury that science does not speak in absolutes. That data requires interpretation. That interpretation reflects human bias. The back and forth was measured, respectful, relentless. This was not a battle of personalities. It was a contest of frameworks. As days turned into weeks, the emotional toll became visible. Jurors shifted in their seats more often. The family grew quieter, fatigue etched into their faces. The absence of the victim was felt most acutely in these moments, when discussion turned to aftermath, and there was nothing concrete to point to. No location. No remains. Just inference and implication. The defense leaned into that void. The prosecution acknowledged it without apology. Closing arguments approached with a sense of inevitability. Both sides knew what they had. Both knew what they lacked. The prosecution spoke last, returning to first principles. They reminded the jury that reasonable doubt does not mean imagined doubt, that certainty is not required, only conviction grounded in evidence. They spoke of the road, the timing, the behavior, the silence that followed. They asked the jury to consider what explanation fit all of it without forcing coincidence beyond credibility. The defense responded with equal calm. They warned against filling gaps with narrative, against mistaking alignment for inevitability. They spoke of liberty, of precedent, of the danger of allowing persistence to substitute for proof. They asked the jury to remember the missing pieces, to respect the power of not knowing. Their final words lingered, heavy with implication. Deliberations began behind closed doors, the case sealed away with 12 people and their consciences. Hours passed. Then a full day. Then another. Outside, speculation ran unchecked. Inside, discussion moved slowly, deliberately. Jurors revisited testimony, requested readbacks, argued over interpretation. Some leaned toward guilt. Others resisted. The absence of a body loomed largest here, an anchor dragging certainty back into doubt. At one point, the jury asked to review the timeline again. The same minutes, the same movements, the same silence. For some, it clarified. For others, it complicated. The case refused to resolve easily, even now. That was its nature. It had never offered simplicity. It demanded judgment without comfort. When the verdict was finally reached, it did not arrive with fanfare. Just a knock on the door. A note passed. The courtroom filled again, tension thick enough to feel. The defendant stood. The family held their breath. The clerk read the words slowly, deliberately, each syllable landing with irreversible force. Whatever the outcome, one truth became immediately clear. This verdict would not end the story. It would define it. It would determine how the last 20 years were remembered, how the disappearance was framed, how the silence was interpreted. Justice, if achieved, would be incomplete. If denied, it would be devastating. The judge thanked the jury, dismissed them back into anonymity. The defendant was led away or released, depending on those few words. Cameras flashed outside. Statements were prepared. Reactions crystallized quickly, opinions hardening within minutes. Inside the courtroom, after everyone had gone, the absence remained. Unchanged. The verdict had answered one question, perhaps the most important one legally. But it had not answered the one that mattered most to those who had waited the longest. What happened, exactly, after that car was left on the side of the road? The silence had been judged. But it still had not confessed. The verdict did not quiet the case. It amplified it. Within hours, the language around the disappearance began to shift, reshaped by opinion and allegiance. Some called it closure. Others called it compromise. Headlines hardened into positions, and the story that had lived in shadows for decades was pulled once more into the light, examined, contested, reinterpreted. The courtroom doors had closed, but the public conversation was just beginning. Outside, the family spoke carefully, words chosen with restraint born of exhaustion. Relief and grief coexisted without resolution. They thanked the investigators, the jury, the strangers who had not let the case die. Yet beneath the formal statements, there was something unresolved, a hesitation when asked if this was the end. Because endings require certainty, and certainty had never been this case's currency. The defense issued its own response, emphasizing principles over emotion. They spoke of fairness, of standards, of the danger of narrative replacing proof. Appeals were hinted at, then confirmed. The case, they insisted, was not finished. It would move now into a colder arena, where transcripts replaced testimony and arguments were stripped of tone and gesture. The law would continue its slow examination. In the days that followed, analysts dissected the trial. Experts debated the weight of circumstantial evidence, the role of evolving technology, the ethics of reopening wounds long scarred over. Podcasts dedicated entire seasons to the case, replaying old interviews, reanalyzing timelines, questioning assumptions that had once seemed settled. The disappearance became content again, consumed by people far removed from its consequences. Online forums ignited with renewed intensity. Amateur investigators returned to maps and photos, convinced that something had still been missed. New theories surfaced, some plausible, others wildly speculative. Names of secondary figures were dragged back into circulation, their lives once again interrupted by association. The internet did what it always does, flattening nuance into certainty, doubt into accusation. Law enforcement found itself in an unfamiliar position. The case had been tried, judged, but not silenced. Requests for records increased. Freedom of information petitions multiplied. Retired officers were sought out for comment, their recollections treated as potential revelations. Some cooperated. Others declined. A few contradicted the official narrative, not out of malice, but memory's natural erosion. One detail, long considered minor, began to resurface in these discussions. A discrepancy in timing. A gap that had been explained but not eliminated. It had not altered the verdict, but it lingered in the margins, a footnote that refused to stay quiet. Analysts returned to it, recalculating, reframing, asking whether it mattered more than the jury had been led to believe. The prosecution maintained its position. The case, they said, was never about a single detail. It was about convergence. About the alignment of actions, opportunities, silences. They acknowledged imperfection, reiterated confidence. From their perspective, justice had been served as fully as the evidence allowed. The law does not promise certainty, only judgment. Yet even within official circles, there was an undercurrent of unease. Not regret, not reversal, but recognition. The absence of a body, of a definitive account, meant the story could never be fully sealed. It would remain vulnerable to doubt, to revision, to the possibility that some fragment of truth still lay undiscovered. Years of waiting had taught the community how to live with that kind of uncertainty. They had built rituals around it. Annual vigils. Quiet memorials without graves. Conversations that always circled back to the same unanswered question. The verdict altered those rituals, but did not erase them. It added context, not closure. For the younger generation, the case became history, something learned rather than lived. They knew it through articles and documentaries, not through fear or proximity. But even for them, the story carried weight. It was a reminder that resolution is not guaranteed, that time does not always clarify, that some events resist explanation no matter how thoroughly they are examined. The location where the car had been found remained unchanged, unmarked. Drivers passed it without knowing its significance, unaware that it had once been the center of a search that spanned counties and years. The landscape had absorbed the event, indifferent to its meaning. Nature does not preserve memory. People do. Appeals moved forward quietly, predictably. Legal arguments focused on procedure, on evidentiary thresholds, on whether the passage of time had compromised fairness. Each filing reignited attention, briefly pulling the case back into headlines before it receded again. The rhythm became familiar. Flare, fade, wait. Through it all, one question persisted, unaltered by verdict or debate. What happened in those final moments, unseen by witnesses, unrecorded by devices, unpreserved by evidence? The trial had offered a version, one deemed credible enough to convict or acquit. But versions are not experiences. They are reconstructions, shaped by necessity. Some nights, locals still reported thinking they saw someone who resembled the victim. A face in a crowd. A silhouette at a distance. These sightings were never substantiated, never pursued with urgency. They were understood for what they were, echoes of unresolved loss, the mind's refusal to accept absence as final. Investigators, now older, spoke less publicly. When they did, it was with measured reflection. They acknowledged the toll of carrying an unsolved case, the way it lingers in decision-making, in dreams, in moments of quiet. Some expressed relief that the case had reached a legal conclusion. Others admitted that it had not given them the peace they had expected. The case file itself grew thicker, not thinner. Addenda, commentary, analysis. It became less a record of events and more a chronicle of interpretation. Future scholars would study it not just for what it revealed about the disappearance, but for what it showed about justice, memory, and the limits of reconstruction. In the end, the story settled into its new shape. No longer an open question, but not a closed one either. A verdict without a body. An answer without a scene. It occupied a space between resolution and doubt, where many cold cases eventually reside if they are touched at all. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the arguments and the analysis, beneath the certainty and the skepticism, the original silence remained. Untouched by language. Unmoved by judgment. Because whatever the law had decided, whatever the public believed, the truth of that night still existed only in one place. And it was not talking. Time moved on, but not forward. It moved in circles around the case, returning to it whenever something new brushed against the old wounds. A rumor. A death. A box uncovered in a storage unit. Each incident carried the same electric charge, the same promise that this might finally be the moment when the silence broke. Most of the time, it wasn't. But the anticipation never faded. Years after the verdict, a routine audit inside a county evidence facility uncovered materials long thought lost. Nothing dramatic at first glance. Faded labels. Misfiled reports. A cassette tape with a date smudged beyond certainty. Bureaucratic artifacts, the kind that accumulate quietly over decades. But when investigators reviewed the contents, a familiar unease surfaced. The sense that something had been set aside too quickly. Not ignored. Deferred. The tape contained an interview. Short. Incomplete. A voice unfamiliar to the public record. Someone who had been questioned early on, dismissed as peripheral, their statement deemed inconsistent, but not suspicious. Listening now, with the benefit of everything that had followed, the words sounded different. Not incriminating. Not exculpatory. Just unresolved. A narrative that didn't fit cleanly into any version already accepted. The discovery was logged, reviewed, then quietly circulated among a small group of officials. No press release. No announcement. The case was legally settled, and reopening discussion carried risks. But the material existed now, and existence alone was enough to disturb the equilibrium that had formed around the story. Once again, the past had found a way to intrude. Investigators debated its significance. Some argued it changed nothing. Others insisted it warranted at least a review. The law allowed for post-conviction analysis under narrow conditions, but this did not meet the threshold. Still, the tape was transcribed. The transcript was read and reread. Certain phrases were underlined. Pauses noted. The absence of follow-up questions became conspicuous. Word leaked, not officially, but inevitably. A line in a legal blog. A comment in a forum frequented by retired detectives and journalists. The case stirred again, this time without permission. Speculation ignited before facts could settle. What had been found? Why it hadn't been used? What it might mean now? The family learned of it through indirect channels, as they always had. No formal briefing. Just a call from someone who had heard something from someone else. The cycle resumed, hope tempered by experience, curiosity restrained by exhaustion. They had learned not to expect resolution. Only revision. Requests followed. For the tape. For the transcript. For an explanation. Officials responded carefully, citing legal constraints, privacy considerations, the finality of verdicts. Their words were accurate, but accuracy did not satisfy. It never does in cases like this. The public had tasted uncertainty again, and it wanted more. Independent analysts obtained a copy of the transcript through unofficial means. They published annotated versions, dissecting language, speculating on tone, inferring intent from syntax. Some claimed it undermined the prosecution's timeline. Others argued it reinforced it. The same words became evidence for opposing conclusions, a familiar pattern repeating itself. What unsettled many was not what the interview said, but what it suggested. That the early investigation, constrained by urgency and limited resources, may have narrowed too quickly. That alternative pathways had existed, briefly illuminated, then abandoned. Not through negligence. Through necessity. Cold cases are shaped as much by what is ignored as by what is pursued. Law enforcement issued a statement acknowledging the discovery, but downplaying its relevance. The case, they said, had been thoroughly examined, and no new evidence had emerged that altered its conclusions. It was a measured response, crafted to contain rather than inflame. It did neither. For a time, the story regained momentum. News outlets revisited the disappearance with updated timelines. Documentaries added epilogues. The phrase, newly uncovered evidence, appeared in headlines, carefully hedged by qualifiers. Viewers leaned in, conditioned by years of unresolved endings. Then, slowly, interest waned again. No motion was filed. No hearing scheduled. The tape remained an artifact, not a catalyst. The system absorbed the disturbance and returned to stasis. For most people, the case receded once more into the background of unresolved history. But for those closest to it, something had shifted. Not belief. Not certainty. But awareness. The knowledge that the story was still incomplete, still vulnerable to interruption. That the past had not finished speaking, even if no one was listening closely enough. The location tied to the new material was visited again, discreetly. No search teams. No equipment. Just quiet observation. The landscape offered nothing in response. It never had. Whatever truth it once held had either been removed or concealed too deeply to be recovered now. As years continued to pass, those connected to the case aged. Some died. Others retired. Institutional memory thinned. What remained was documentation and interpretation, preserved but inert. The disappearance itself grew more abstract, its human core softened by repetition. Yet on certain nights, when conditions aligned just right, when noise faded and attention sharpened, the case felt present again. Not as a narrative, but as a weight. A reminder that resolution is not synonymous with truth. That answers can exist without explanation. The tape was eventually archived, catalogued properly at last. Its existence noted, its contents summarized, its impact officially negligible. But it remained there, waiting. Like so much else in the case. Not erased. Not resolved. Just paused. And in that pause, the silence endured, unbroken and deliberate, holding fast to whatever it still refused to give up. The pause did not feel empty. It felt loaded. Like a held breath stretched too long, uncomfortable but intentional. The case existed in that space now, suspended between archival order and latent disorder, where nothing officially happened, but everything felt possible. It lingered in footnotes, in conversations that began with "remember that case," in quiet moments when the mind wandered back without invitation. A decade after the verdict, a death quietly reconfigured the landscape. A secondary figure, never charged, never publicly named as central, passed away in another state under circumstances unrelated and unremarkable. There was no immediate connection, no headline linking the two events. But among those who knew the file intimately, the news landed differently. This was someone who had brushed against the edges of the investigation early on, someone whose story had been partially corroborated and partially set aside. Someone who could no longer clarify anything. Their belongings were processed routinely. An estate inventory. Boxes of personal effects. Old paperwork. Nothing suggested relevance until a relative, sorting through the remnants, found a folder marked only with a date. Inside were clippings. Local news articles. A grainy photograph printed from an early website. The victim's name appeared more than once, circled in pen. It was not evidence. It was interest. But interest, in this context, was enough to reopen old questions. The relative hesitated before coming forward. Not out of fear, but uncertainty. Decades had passed. The case was resolved, at least legally. What difference could this make now? Eventually, the material was turned over quietly, accompanied by a statement that explained nothing and apologized for wasting time. It did not waste time. Investigators reviewed the contents with cautious discipline. There was nothing actionable. No confession. No map. No indication of guilt. But there was familiarity. A pattern of attention that had never been documented before. Dates aligned loosely with known developments in the case. Articles highlighted specific details, not the sensational ones, but the procedural gaps. The unanswered questions. The moments where the narrative had faltered. Again, debate followed. Was this fixation or coincidence? Curiosity or conscience? People collect articles for many reasons. The dead cannot explain themselves. The file grew thicker, the margins more crowded with annotations that led nowhere definitive. What troubled some investigators was not what the folder contained, but what it implied about proximity. Knowledge that exceeded what had been publicly reported at the time. Subtle emphasis on elements that had only later become significant. These could be retroactive interpretations, shaped by everything that came after. Or they could be traces of awareness, preserved unintentionally. No announcement was made. The case had reached a stage where discretion outweighed disclosure. Any suggestion of reevaluation risked destabilizing a verdict that had survived scrutiny. The material was logged, cross-referenced, and set aside with the others. Another unresolved thread, neatly catalogued. Still, the discovery altered private conversations. Investigators revisited early decisions, questioning why certain avenues had been abandoned, whether urgency had narrowed focus too aggressively. These were not accusations. They were reflections. The kind that come only after years have passed and consequences have settled. For the family, the news reopened a familiar ache. Not hope exactly, but awareness. The sense that the story still contained rooms that had never been entered. They asked whether anything would come of it. The answer was careful and honest. Probably not. But probably had never been guaranteed anyway. The media caught wind of the development months later, long after its impact had been absorbed internally. Coverage was restrained. A brief segment. A few paragraphs online. The phrase, "no new charges expected," appeared early and often. Interest flickered, then dimmed. Yet something had shifted beneath the surface. The case had absorbed another anomaly without collapsing, but the accumulation was beginning to show. Too many footnotes. Too many maybes. Too many moments that resisted alignment. It did not unravel the official narrative, but it complicated it, adding texture where simplicity had once been asserted. Academics studying cold cases referenced it now as an example of post-resolution instability. A case that demonstrated how legal closure does not equate to narrative stability. How stories continue to evolve long after judgments are rendered. It became a teaching tool, stripped of emotion, abstracted into principle. But abstraction could not erase the human residue. Those who had lived through the early days still felt the weight of it. The searches. The press conferences. The waiting. Time had dulled the edges, but not erased the shape. The disappearance remained a presence, less urgent, but no less real. In quiet moments, some investigators admitted to themselves that they no longer knew what they believed. Not because doubt had grown stronger, but because certainty had weakened. The case had taught them restraint. An understanding that answers assembled from fragments are always provisional, no matter how confidently they are presented. The folder, the tape, the timeline discrepancies, all existed now as a constellation of unresolved elements orbiting a central absence. None could stand alone. Together, they suggested complexity rather than contradiction. A story still incomplete, still resistant to final definition. The system moved on, as it always does. New cases replaced old ones. New urgencies demanded attention. Resources shifted. The disappearance receded again, not forgotten, but deprioritized. It occupied its familiar position, just beyond reach. And somewhere within that distance, the truth remained unchanged. Not hidden, necessarily. Just untouched. Waiting for a question that had not yet been asked in the right way. The silence had endured verdicts, revelations, deaths, and decades. There was no reason to believe it wouldn't endure this too.